December 11, 1941. Adolf Hitler stood before the Reichstag, his voice resonating through the vast hall of the Kroll Opera House as he formally declared war on the United States of America. It had been only 4 days since Japanese aircraft had torn through Pearl Harbor, and the shock of that attack was still rippling across the Pacific. Yet on that cold December morning in Berlin, Hitler made a decision that would ultimately seal the fate of his Reich. As he spoke, methodically listing America's alleged crimes, denouncing President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and promising inevitable German victory, Hitler believed he was acting from a position of clarity and strength. He had no idea what he had truly set in motion. Hitler believed he understood American power. He did not. The man who declared war on the United States that day was operating under assumptions that, to him, seemed rational and internally consistent. Those assumptions were rooted in an ideology he had spent decades constructing, an ideological framework that shaped not only his hatred but his strategy. In Hitler's worldview, the United States was not a genuine nation-state. It was a hybrid society, racially mixed, culturally diluted, and fundamentally weak. He had written as much years earlier in Mein Kampf. American strength, he argued, was an illusion, manufactured by Jewish influence and inflated by propaganda. To Hitler, America was a land of shopkeepers, speculators, and financiers, not warriors. Its society, corrupted by democracy and racial mixing, lacked cohesion. Its people, he believed, lacked discipline. And without discipline, no nation could wage modern war. This belief was not casual prejudice or offhand racism. It was the foundation of his strategic thinking. When German military advisors warned him about American industrial capacity, Hitler dismissed them. When intelligence reports outlined U.S. production figures, he rejected them outright. The numbers could not be real, he insisted, because the people producing them were inferior. How could a nation weakened by racial diversity, Jewish influence, and democratic chaos possibly rival the German Reich, built, in his mind, on order, hierarchy, and racial purity? To Hitler, the question answered itself. So when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Hitler did not see catastrophe. He saw opportunity. The United States would now be forced to fight a two-ocean war. Its forces would be stretched thin, divided between Europe and the Pacific. Germany, Hitler believed, could finish off the Soviet Union before America had time to mobilize its full strength. The war in the East would be decided long before American soldiers ever reached Europe in meaningful numbers. And even if the Americans did arrive, what then? Would they send their soft, undisciplined soldiers across the Atlantic to face the Wehrmacht? Let them come, Hitler believed. They would shatter against German steel like waves against stone. His speech on December 11th reflected that confidence. He spoke at length about American weakness. He accused Roosevelt of warmongering. He framed the conflict as the exposure of a Jewish conspiracy controlling Washington. America's entry into the war, he assured the German people, changed nothing of substance. If anything, it clarified the struggle. The enemy was now revealed. Germany could confront it openly. But far from the Reichstag, in the Ruhr Valley, inside the massive industrial complexes of Essen and Dortmund, some listeners reacted very differently. German industrialists, men who had traveled to the United States before the war, listened to Hitler's words with growing unease. They had walked through American factories. They had seen production lines unlike anything in Europe. They knew that the figures Hitler dismissed were not fabrications. They were real. And that realization filled them not with confidence, but dread. Those German industrialists had not relied on reports or hearsay. Before the war, they had walked the factory floors of the United States. They had seen assembly lines that seemed endless. They had watched raw materials enter one end of buildings and finished products roll out the other without pause. What Hitler dismissed as exaggeration, they recognized as reality. The first concrete warning did not arrive in Berlin through intelligence briefings or captured documents. It came from the open ocean. In early 1942, German U-boat commanders operating in the Atlantic began sending back unsettling reports. Allied convoys were not decreasing in size. They were growing larger. There were more merchant ships, more escorts, more fuel tankers, more cargo vessels than before. Losses mounted, yet the flow of supplies never slowed. This contradicted everything German naval planners expected. German shipyards were already working at full capacity, struggling to replace submarine losses. Steel was scarce. Skilled labor was limited. Yet across the Atlantic, the United States appeared to be replacing sunk ships faster than Germany could destroy them, while also fighting a major naval war against Japan. How was this possible? The answer lay in a ship few Germans had taken seriously at first, the Liberty ship. Across American shipyards, from the Pacific Northwest to the Atlantic seaboard, workers were producing cargo vessels using methods unfamiliar to European tradition. Instead of constructing ships piece by piece from the keel upward, American yards relied on prefabrication. Entire hull sections were manufactured in factories, transported by rail, and welded together on the slipways. This system dramatically reduced construction time. A Liberty ship, from initial keel placement to launch, took roughly 45 days on average. Some yards exceeded even that pace. In 1941, the SS Robert E. Peary was completed in just 7 days. 7 days. When this report reached German naval intelligence, it was treated with skepticism. No serious shipbuilder believed such a feat was possible. The report was classified, questioned, and ultimately dismissed as Allied propaganda intended to undermine morale among U-boat crews. But the evidence did not disappear. The ships kept coming. By the end of 1942, American shipyards had launched more than 700 Liberty ships. By the end of the war, over 2,700 would be built, each capable of carrying tanks, fuel, ammunition, and food across the Atlantic in quantities Germany could not match. The second warning arrived from North Africa. In November 1942, American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria as part of Operation Torch. German commanders prepared to face what Hitler had promised, an inexperienced, poorly led, and unreliable enemy. Early encounters seemed to confirm those expectations. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel struck American positions hard. U.S. units, inexperienced and poorly coordinated, were driven back. American losses were heavy. Retreat followed. When Hitler read the reports, he felt vindicated. This, he believed, was proof. The Americans could not stand against seasoned German troops, but the officers on the ground saw something different. The Americans retreated, but they did not collapse. They withdrew in organized formations, supported by vehicles in remarkable condition. Trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, all fully fueled, all operational. When the Americans returned, they did not return weakened. They returned reinforced. More tanks, more artillery, more ammunition, more food, more fuel. They adapted quickly. Mistakes were corrected. Command structures were reorganized. Equipment that might not have been superior in design proved dependable and abundant. Colonel Hans von Luck, commanding a German armored reconnaissance unit, captured an American supply depot during the fighting. What he found there shocked him. Crates of ammunition stacked in vast rows, barrels of fuel as far as the eye could see, medical supplies, spare parts, rations, piled in quantities he had never encountered. Von Luck later wrote that this single depot contained more supplies than his entire division had received over several months. And this was not a primary front. This was a secondary theater. Reports like his began flowing back to Berlin. The Americans, they warned, were fighting a different kind of war, one built on logistical abundance. Reports from North Africa were soon reinforced by others. U-boat commanders in the Atlantic described convoys that seemed inexhaustible. Luftwaffe pilots reported encountering growing numbers of American aircraft in the skies over Europe. Intelligence officers tracked production figures that continued to rise despite every German effort to disrupt them. Taken together, these reports formed a pattern that could no longer be dismissed. American production was not an illusion. It was real. In Berlin, Albert Speer, once Hitler's chief architect and now Reich Minister of Armaments, was arriving at the same conclusion through different channels. Speer had access to a wide range of information, captured Allied documents, interrogations of prisoners of war, aerial reconnaissance photographs, and reports from German agents operating in neutral countries. He began compiling the data into a single, comprehensive assessment of American industrial capacity. What he discovered deeply unsettled him. The United States, Speer concluded, had transformed its vast peacetime economy into a war-producing machine with astonishing speed. Automobile plants that once manufactured civilian cars were now producing tanks, aircraft engines, and armored vehicles. Entire industries were repurposed almost overnight. One facility stood out. The Ford Willow Run plant in Michigan, constructed specifically to produce B-24 Liberator bombers, represented something Germany had never attempted. By 1944, the plant was producing one complete four-engine bomber every 63 minutes, one aircraft per hour. The factory was so massive that managers used bicycles to travel between sections. Assembly lines ran continuously. Components arrived on schedule. Finished bombers rolled out with industrial regularity. Speer's figures showed that by mid-1943, American aircraft production was approaching 5,000 planes per month. Tank production exceeded 2,000 vehicles monthly. Aluminum output alone surpassed Germany's total wartime production in a single year. Steel, oil, rubber, explosives. American output exceeded German production in every critical category. These figures were not speculative estimates. They were derived from multiple independent sources and cross-checked for accuracy. Speer prepared a detailed presentation for Hitler. Charts, graphs, production comparisons, everything was assembled to demonstrate the scale of what Germany faced. In some categories, American output exceeded Germany's by 3-1. In shipbuilding, the ratio approached 5-1. In certain areas, it was even greater. The meeting took place in early 1943 at Hitler's headquarters in Rastenburg, East Prussia. Speer arrived fully aware of the resistance he would face. Hitler's ideological framework could not accept the idea that a racially mixed democracy could outperform the so-called master race. Still, Speer believed that confronting the Führer with undeniable facts might force a strategic reassessment. Perhaps Germany could seek accommodation with the Western Allies. Perhaps resources could be concentrated more carefully. Perhaps something could be done to slow an otherwise inevitable outcome. Hitler listened as Speer presented the data. As the numbers grew larger, his agitation became visible. He interrupted frequently, questioning sources, demanding explanations, accusing Speer of believing enemy lies. The figures were impossible, Hitler insisted. They violated everything he believed about race, industry, and natural order. Speer persisted. He presented aerial reconnaissance photographs of American factories. He cited testimony from German prisoners who had been held in the United States and witnessed production firsthand. He referenced captured documents outlining manufacturing schedules and output targets. He demonstrated that American economic output had nearly doubled since 1939, while Germany's had increased only marginally. Hitler rejected it all. The photographs could be staged, the prisoners deceived, the documents forged. The Americans, he argued, were masters of deception and propaganda. Germany must not fall for such tricks. Yet even as he dismissed the presentation, doubt began to surface. If American production truly existed on this scale, Hitler asked, why had it not already overwhelmed Germany? Speer answered simply, because of time and distance. American factories, Speer explained, were producing weapons and equipment at unprecedented levels. But production alone did not win wars. Those weapons had to be transported across oceans, crews had to be trained to use them, and massive logistical systems had to be constructed to sustain armies in combat. All of that required time. That time, however, was steadily disappearing. The next warning reached Germany from above. In 1943, American B-17 flying fortresses began appearing in the skies over the Reich. At first, the raids involved dozens of bombers. Then the numbers increased to hundreds. By early 1944, formations of more than 1,000 aircraft struck German industrial centers in a single mission. The Luftwaffe, and the Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in Europe, found itself increasingly overwhelmed. German fighter pilots, many of them veterans with years of combat experience, shot down American bombers in significant numbers. Yet, the effect was temporary. The Americans kept coming. For every bomber destroyed, replacements appeared within days. For every German fighter lost, the United States fielded several new aircraft flown by newly trained pilots. German ace pilot Heinz Knoke recorded the change in his diary. Over the course of months, he watched his squadron shrink from 24 aircraft to 6. They were winning individual engagements, he wrote, but losing the war of attrition. The enemy's losses simply did not matter in the way German losses did. The Americans had more of everything: more aircraft, more pilots, more fuel, more ammunition. The Luftwaffe's once elite training system could not keep pace. Fuel shortages forced reductions in flight training. New pilots reached combat units with barely 50 hours of experience, compared to the 200 hours common earlier in the war. Many were shot down within their first few missions. American pilots arrived differently prepared. They entered combat with more than 250 hours of training. Those who survived their initial missions quickly adapted, learning tactics, formations, and survival skills that made them increasingly dangerous opponents. This disparity was not about courage. German pilots remained brave and skilled. The difference lay in resources. American industrial capacity translated directly into combat power. The United States could afford extended pilot training because fuel was abundant. It could accept aircraft losses because factories replaced them faster than Germany could destroy them. It could experiment with tactics because it had the numbers to absorb mistakes. In late 1943, Hitler received a report from Luftwaffe High Command detailing American aircraft production figures. The data was impossible to ignore. The United States had produced more than 85,000 military aircraft in 1943 alone. Germany, straining every factory to its limits, had produced approximately 25,000. America was outproducing Germany by more than 3-1, while simultaneously supplying Britain and the Soviet Union and fighting a full-scale war against Japan in the Pacific. Hitler read the report without speaking. Then he asked a question that revealed the erosion of his certainty. How is this possible? For years, he had dismissed American strength as propaganda. Now the evidence came from his own commanders, his own pilots, and his own intelligence services. If the Americans could build 85,000 aircraft in a single year, what else had he misunderstood? The answer would arrive in 1944. The final answer arrived in June 1944. American and Allied forces landed in Normandy. Hitler had expected an invasion. He had ordered defenses prepared, divisions positioned, counterattacks planned. What he had not anticipated was the scale of what came ashore. On June 6, 1944, more than 156,000 Allied troops landed on the beaches of France. They were supported by over 7,000 ships and landing craft, 5,000 aircraft, and a logistical system unlike anything the Wehrmacht had ever encountered. Within days, supplies poured ashore in overwhelming quantities. Within weeks, Allied forces were unloading more than 30,000 tons of material per day. Artificial harbors, mulberries, were constructed where none had existed. Fuel pipelines were laid beneath the English Channel, roads were repaired, depots established, and supply routes expanded inland with relentless efficiency. German commanders who had fought in North Africa, who had already witnessed American logistical abundance, were still stunned by what they saw in France. Colonel Hans von Luck, now commanding forces in Normandy, watched endless American supply convoys roll inland. Trucks stretched for miles. Fuel tankers followed artillery units. Replacement vehicles arrived faster than losses could be recorded. At that moment, von Luck later wrote, he understood with certainty that Germany had lost the war. Not because American soldiers were inherently superior, though they were learning rapidly. Not because American tanks were revolutionary, though they were reliable and plentiful. But because the United States could sustain war on a scale Germany could never match. For every German artillery shell fired, the Allies responded with 10. For every tank destroyed, multiple replacements appeared. For every defensive position overrun, fresh troops and fresh supplies followed immediately behind. In East Prussia, Hitler received reports from Normandy with growing desperation. He demanded counterattacks. He ordered divisions to hold ground at all costs. He insisted that German willpower would overcome American material superiority. It did not. The Allies were not merely landing armies. They were landing an entire industrial economy, manufactured in factories, transported across oceans, and reassembled on European soil. By late 1944, even Hitler could no longer deny reality. In conversations recorded by stenographers, his tone began to change. He still blamed generals, traitors, and conspiracies, but beneath the accusations lay an undeniable recognition. American industrial power was real. In January 1945, Hitler spoke with something approaching awe. The Americans, he admitted, had built a war machine operating on principles he had never fully understood. Not brilliance of tactics, not ideological purity, but overwhelming abundance. They did not need to defeat Germany through genius. They could simply outlast it. The numbers told the story Speer had tried to explain years earlier. By the end of the war, the United States had produced nearly 300,000 military aircraft. Germany had produced just over 100,000. America built close to 90,000 tanks. Germany produced roughly 40,000. Liberty ships alone numbered more than 2,700, excluding destroyers, landing craft, and transport vessels. The United States produced enough not only to equip its own forces, but to supply its allies. American tanks fought under Soviet markings. American trucks carried British soldiers. American food fed armies, from Western Europe to the Pacific. In the final days inside the Berlin bunker, Hitler understood what he had set in motion on December 11, 1941. He had declared war on a nation whose industrial capacity exceeded his imagination. A nation whose ability to project power across oceans made geography irrelevant. A nation whose flexible economic system could mobilize resources in ways his rigid ideology never could. To truly understand American power would have required Hitler to abandon everything he believed about race, democracy, and strength. That was impossible. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life. 8 days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war he believed would establish a 1,000-year Reich had lasted less than 6. Hitler came to understand American power the way a drowning man understands the sea, too late, too completely, and with no chance of escape.